we got news that Mirko Cro Cop had suffered a stroke following his fight with Roy Nelson and subsequently retired. You and I had speculated on this show many times that likely the Fedor rematch would be his swan song. And this is a guy who provided us with no shortage of memories, but Mirko Cro Cop has been advised to not take any more shots to the head. This is sad. We thought that he was going to go a couple times, but it looks like this is it.
Well, yeah. I mean, after you have a stroke, I think that's pretty much the basics there. I've seen fighters before a long time ago when I was with Apex Championship Fighting. A gentleman, I think his name was Stefan Potvin, had an amazing future. I mean, he was a training partner, I think, of George St. Pierre, if I'm not mistaken, or was on the same lineage, and took a shot to the neck from Luigi Fioravanti. Like the punch missed his neck, hit him in the left side of his throat, and I believe he had a stroke in the fight. He was okay. He continued, but after speaking with the doctors, that was the end of his career. But Mirko Cro Cop, for example, has had an absolutely masterful career. People can say what they want about, going back to Japan and all that stuff there. But the bottom line is, like you said, he gave us a ton of memories. And I was just completely and utterly blessed, not just to meet him numerous times and interview him and hang out with him, but to be able to call his fights, especially that run he had in the Ryzen Heavyweight Grand Prix and emerging victorious with that, shocking everybody. So yeah, it's sad news. It'd have been much, much nicer, like you said, for that swan song, because he was chasing Fedor. I mean, I think I made that pretty clear in a lot of these broadcasts that he was definitely chasing Fedor. He wanted that one to be his last fight ever. Unfortunately, not going to happen.
Now, he debuted in MMA in August 2001. He was a fixture in Pride, especially, but he made his debut in K1. He fought Fujita. He would go on to fight Fujita again later on. How much had his kickboxing reputation preceded him by the time you found out who he was in MMA? Were you aware of him outside of that? He had a boxing career and a kickboxing career well before that where he competed in K1.
Truth be told, no. I knew a little bit about him. I knew that his striking background, because back then with MMA the way it was, and Pride was the big dog, the UFC was not. A lot of our focus was on Pride, and we were just looking forward to who were these guys that they're bringing in. If you remember Igor Vovchanchin, no one had heard of him, and then he steps into the ring and starts causing crazy havoc in the heavyweight division. So when Cro Cop first made his debut, I vividly remember knowing that he's got a kickboxing background. But to me, I was such a jiu-jitsu guy back then. Like, I had a boxing and kickboxing background before I got into jiu-jitsu and a little bit of wrestling. But to me, it was all about, what do you bring to the fight? You can bring your A style, which is your kickboxing, but how is it going to translate to MMA? And it translated pretty damn well.
You want to talk about a run outside of that Michael McDonald fight in K1 in the world at the World GP 2001? He had an insane 2001, 2002, 2003 leading up to that Nogueira loss. He beat Peter Ertz. He just went on this wild streak of beating like Remy Bojanski and Bob Sapp and I think Mark Hunt in kickboxing, and he also beat Sakuraba. He had the fight with Vanderlei Silva. He beat Heath Herring. He beat Fujita again. He beat Igor again. He had the infamous knockout over the eventual WWE champion, Alberto Del Rio, who was Dos Caras Jr., the masked man head kick, which Chael Sonnen kind of suggested that, well, Cro Cop didn't know it was a work, but Dos Caras did, and Alberto Del Rio has told us in recent years, I wish it was, but that was quite a way to establish yourself. This is what got me into MMA again, Joe. I always joke about UFC 5 and about how I saw John Hess on that videotape. I didn't watch a lot of UFC after that. My cousin he ordered this pay-per-view on DirecTV, and he was like, you have to watch this. These are real fights. And these guys are doing finishing moves like pro wrestlers. Like this guy has a move that finishes everybody. This other guy is power bombing people and power slamming people, and it's finishing them. And I was like, what is it? That can happen? I didn't know anything but Big John Hess. So to see Mirko Cro Cop and that technical supremacy in which he possessed and how he was able to throw that. He even had a catchphrase, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
He even had a catchphrase. I didn't understand him when he talked, but he had a catchphrase, Joe. He beat Josh Barnett and Kevin Randleman and Mark Coleman. I can't tell you how instrumental this guy was to my fandom of MMA. If there's no Cro Cop, I don't know if I'm doing this podcast with you right now. Like, it's It's amazing. And he was integral to Pride at that point, right?
Oh yeah, he was part of the big dogs. I mean, all those Grand Prix that they had with Fedor and Big Nog and whatnot, you just never knew who was going to make it to the finale or the finals every single New Year's Eve show. So he was something else. I mean, I remember when he eventually came to the UFC and how guarded he was. And I was lucky enough, and I've said it before. I always thank Jen Wank, who was the PR coordinator or director of PR before Dave Schaller. She was the one that granted me the only interview Cro Cop was going to do with any media, and this was in Vancouver, and you know it was mostly part of it luck, obviously being the broadcast partner of the UFC back then, and having built my reputation, you know, sort of like how James Lynch is right now. When you're respected, you know, the fighters will give you a chance. And I remember Fedor's first one or two answers were so reserved, and then afterwards he opened up and you know answered the questions very, very succinctly, and then after the interview, you know, to thank you, walked away, and then came back and said, "Thank you very much for those questions. They were legit questions. They weren't, you know, they weren't rude. They weren't mean. That you didn't put me on the spot." I said, "It's never my intention to do that. I'm going to ask you, you know, what's out there right now, but I want to know more." I mean, I asked my questions not only on behalf of the media but for the fans as well, because there's a lot of things that we all want to know. So he was very happy with that interview, and then I translated back when I got to Ryzen and you know Trig and I and whatnot and whomever, whether it was Heath Herring or whoever was working the shows. Every time, you know, Mirko would come over to our to the second floor of the Hyatt where we do our interviews, he was smiling ear to ear, and it was always a different Fedor. Now he's also, Sean, he got older and more mature and realized that, you know, that you don't have to be so serious in life and whatnot. But it was a different cat altogether, and it was just amazing to you know, again, I might be in my mid 40s right now. I'm still a fanboy when I was 25, 22, or you know, in 1993 when the UFC first came out and Pride in its heyday in the late 90s. I'm still in awe sometimes that I get to do what I do, and you see one of those legends and those guys like Cro Cop. You're just kind of like, man, I remember just like when I was a nobody at a bar in Midtown Toronto, trying to find out if someone's going to be showing Pride somewhere, and being able to watch this guy, to get into VHS copies and watching it over and over. Yeah, I said VHS. You know,
I'm old enough to remember it too.
Here. I probably have some. You know what? I'm going to use my feet real quick because people will probably laugh. But I've got a ton. I don't know if you can see that.
Wow.
A ton of VHSs that I have. I don't know what I'm going to do with them, Sean.
Hey, that's what we had the Pride pay-per-view recorded on. We still, as of 15 years ago, we were still using VHS.
Yeah.
And I remember watching Liddell Couture over at a friend's house. But aside from that, I wasn't that big into UFC going into 2007. That same cousin would say, "Hey, while you're online, why don't you check the results of this Pride show for me?" And I was like, "All right." And I would try to track down when WWE wrestlers would go over to MMA, how they would do. But then UFC 67 happened, Joe. And you look back, and looking back, it's amazing. Anderson Silva, Cro Cop, Rampage Jackson, Frankie Edgar, Lyoto Machida. GSP was actually scheduled for that show to fight Sarah as well, but they had to postpone that fight about a month ahead of time. The Anderson Silva title fight fell out, and that didn't feel like the main event. Anderson Silva didn't feel like the main event that night to me.
No.
Mirko Cro Cop and Rampage Jackson being on those shows in, by all intents and purposes, Joe, what we call in pro wrestling enhancement matches. You know, where they put them against people that probably aren't on their level. Now, granted, Marvin Eastman had beaten Rampage Jackson before, but Eddie Sanchez, I don't know anybody that was picking him to win that fight. And to be fair, he was undefeated. He was 6-0. He had just won a fight the prior year in the UFC, but nobody was picking him to win that fight. Cro Cop beat him, and he was immediately launched into a heavyweight title eliminator with Gabriel Gonzaga.
Yeah.
And then we get what is one of the biggest upsets, at that point at least, in the history of MMA. Mirko Cro Cop gets head kicked with, quite frankly, not a very good technical kick. There was no turning of the hips. He got caught with the ankle on top of the head. He's folded like a lawn chair. Not like a lawn chair. Lawn chairs fold correctly. His ankle went behind his back. I can't remember who the ref was, but great awareness on the ref to unfold the leg and all that. What went through your mind when you saw that?
It was Well, first it was the elbows. Remember the elbows that he was enduring on the ground, right? Like, I mean, he was
Yeah.
just taking a beating, and he was wobbly. But then nobody saw the finishing move that Cro Cop uses on all his opponents by the very opponent who is not really known for his kicks, and like you said, isn't technically sound when he throws them. So when he landed the kick and and Cro Cop completely folded, I remember just being, it was like when you realize it's a moment in time, everything freezes for that second or so. And you're just like, what in the blue moon just happened? Holy smokes, this is insane. What, and you realize where you were at the time when this crazy thing just happened. So it was insane. It kind of blew my mind away, but it also opened up my eyes again. And you get these examples every so often that anybody can win a fight at any time. You can never prejudge two men or women stepping into a cage or ring and think this is what's going to happen. We can break it down, but they got to get in there and fight, and anything can happen. And that was another proof with Gonzaga winning that fight, that anything can happen, and sometimes in dramatic fashion.
Things didn't get a lot better. There was that fight with Czech Congo, and Cro Cop was out of the UFC just a mere 9 months after he was in the UFC. He was gone. And I thought that might have been it. He went over to Japan, had 3 fights in 2008. He famously just chopped down Hongman Choi. He got kneed in the balls by Overeem. Won at Dream 1, but not a lot to that. But then he came back to the UFC, and he had a good little run. He won 3 of 4 fights, lost to Junior Dos Santos. That's going to happen. And then he had some real bad, underwhelming fights. Not just bad, underwhelming fights, but fights that were really bad. Then he would get finished at the end of those really bad fights. So it's bad enough that they're terrible, but then when you get put away at the end of terrible fights, Mir, Schaub, Nelson, did you think we had seen the last of Mirko Cro Cop in the UFC? Because he was riding a 3-fight losing streak, and even at that point, he was in his late 30s.
Yeah. I thought that was the end. I thought that was, okay, you know what? You had your run. You had your prime, especially in Pride. You've come over to the UFC. You're just not, you don't have that, what we perceived back then as that killer instinct anymore to set up that right kick or that left high kick. The moniker that he used all the time, the catchphrase, right kick to the hospital, left kick to the cemetery, or vice versa. I forgot which one it was, but he didn't have it anymore, right? And he was just getting dominated by the UFC heavyweights. And there was always that, the mentality back then was, we want to see your fighters versus our fighters, because it was so big, and the UFC was building and building and building and building, while Pride had to, went through that whole debacle back in the day, that now the fighters needed somewhere to go to. Let's bring them over to the UFC. They came to the UFC and they weren't winning. And Cro Cop was getting, like you said, demolished. And I thought that was it. No more, done. And he had the resurgence, and the resurgence proved otherwise.
And the resurgence continued up until his retirement, to be quite honest. Like, he again went away. He went to IGF, Inoki's company. He lost to Alexei Oleinik, and that's the only MMA loss he's had since his UFC run. That's it. And Alexei Oleinik is still competing at the top levels of the UFC. He beat Satoshi Ishii a couple times in a row and got back into the UFC, but it was for 1 fight. But it was against Gabriel Gonzaga.
Yeah.
And that comeback and win with those elbows was something special. What happened afterwards was him failing a drug test. But man, that is, outside of the drug test, you can't think of a better way to end, realistically, Cro Cop's UFC story, can you? I mean, three runs, and he finally beats the guy that derailed everything for him. Yes.
It's the vengeance match, right? It's the one that you want to sort of go back and say, a lot of fighters always go through that, right? They want to know exactly, how do I avenge that one loss or that second loss or whatever it is, right? And he was able to do it. So it's actually fun. I'm actually enjoying reminiscing about Cro Cop's career now. It's actually fantastic.
Yeah, the GSP one did so well last week. I think whenever somebody retires, we're going to do these deep dives, especially considering that you've covered them for so long and you have such a connection. Well, after that UFC run, he wasn't done. He came over to Ryzen and had, quite frankly, a really, really great couple of years. Beat King Mo, beat Alec Bari. He was finishing people, Joe. I mean, like, with arm triangles.
Yeah, and he predicted those before the fight. I'm going to do
Yeah.
that. It was, I mean, when he told Frank and I that, you'll see, I'll get the takedown and I'll get that submission. And when he did it, I think you can hear me when I'm calling it. I'm just kind of like, what the heck? Like, it was just insane. So it was awesome.
And it wasn't just that. Leading up to his UFC run, he was kickboxing again, and he was doing good. He was beating Ray Sefo and Darrell Miller. The only person that he lost to was Remy Bojanski via majority decision. Now, he had that 2012 K1 World Grand Prix title that was a little controversial at that. But up until the Roy Nelson fight, we're talking 10 straight wins in MMA, 11 out of 12. In combat, out of his last 20 fights, Joe, the man had won 18 fights. Now, you can say what you want about competition. You can say what you want about whatever else he was doing. That ain't an accident. You can't win 18 out of 20 on accident at heavyweight in combat sports. The man still had some talent. And I'm, quite frankly, very sad to see him go.